So thank you, Stephen Smith. You are known as a prominent expert in nonprofit organizations and social policy that looks at public management of nonprofits. Thank you very much for being here. I wondered if perhaps you could share a few thoughts on why you find this space so interesting and what compels you to do research about the nonprofit sector.
Thank you very much, Anita. I'm very pleased to be here and have the opportunity to talk with you about these issues. I originally got interested in the nonprofit sector, when I was in college, working in some local service organizations, and then after college worked in direct services in child welfare agencies in New England, and that kind of got me more interested in working in the sector. And then after a period of doing direct service work, I decided to get a PhD, where I would do research on the nonprofit sector. And so my career over 30 years has been looking at nonprofits, particularly community-based organizations. And I find it a very rewarding and interesting sector because a lot of innovation occurs in the nonprofit sector. There are a lot of people who are very passionate about helping society and addressing important public problems, and so that it's a creative and always changing sector that I think also contributes greatly to the diversity in society, and because you have people who have many different perspectives, and it offers an opportunity for people, individuals as well as groups of people, to create new organizations much more quickly than they might be able to do otherwise, and again contribute in a way that helps address important social problems.
And I know you do some teaching in the space. I teach as well, and one of the questions that I get asked a lot by students, and I wonder if the same happens to you and if you have any thoughts on the matter, students that feel alignment with the nonprofit sector, the plural sector of social entrepreneurship, social innovation, and feel that they have to make this big decision about pursuing a career, at least initially, where they earn more money, either to pay off debt or to sort of establish themselves on a career path. What feedback do you offer your students about that big decision or dilemma?
Well, it certainly is a dilemma, and many of my students have certainly faced that dilemma. I think that and I think that many of my students have found that they have traded off a higher salary for upward mobility and a chance to achieve positions of substantial authority in the nonprofit sector. I think another attraction of the nonprofit sector is that many nonprofits allow students who have studied social innovation or nonprofit management at either the undergraduate or the graduate level to move into positions of authority and then move up relatively quickly. And so many of these my former students have been able to earn higher salaries in a relatively short span of time in ways that might not be possible if you were working in the public sector or the for-profit sector. I think it's also true that it's important for people to think about working in all three sectors today, because
the tri-sector athlete.
That many students now might start off working in the nonprofit sector, and then there'll be an opportunity to work in the public sector or the nonprofit or the for-profit sector, or vice versa, and because with the growth of nonprofits and the interest in social entrepreneurship, there are many organizations that exist in all three sectors that are in a particular field, whether it's the arts or social services. You have public organizations, for-profit as well as nonprofit organizations. And so as my former students gain experience, they find that they have employment opportunities in all three sectors.
So you know that the MOOC that we're working on is called Social Learning for Social Impact, and we are looking at social initiatives, which is a larger term than nonprofits or social enterprise, because we want to cover the entire array of organizations within the plural sector.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means social enterprises that might earn a profit as part of their revenue model for sustainability.
Right.
It might mean more traditional nonprofit organizations and the whole gamut in between. I'm wondering if you could comment on what you're seeing that is, deemed social innovation with nonprofit organizations that are collaborating more closely with the beneficiaries of their services, on the ground, grassroots. Because my understanding is that you're looking at that and you're seeing a really great trend around that.
Yes. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's a very important one. I think that certainly a lot of attention in this space around social enterprise and social innovation has been on organizations that that combine some kind of market activity with their social mission, the so-called double bottom line. But I think that there's also been a lot of innovation in ways that nonprofits relate to the beneficiaries of their services or their larger community. And both, I think you see that in Canada and the U.S. as well as in Europe. And I think it manifests itself in a number of different ways, and I think it's being driven by a couple larger trends that are affecting organizations in the plural sector. And so that is one of those. One of those is the more competition for resources, right? The number of nonprofits has increased. Government funding is either been cut back, or it's certainly scarcer and more competitive than it used to be, and individual donations is very competitive to raise individual donations. So I think many nonprofits are finding, particularly now I'm talking about community-based organizations, that having broad-based community support is beneficial to help them in the competition for resources. And so they're thinking creatively about ways that they can engage the community, broadly defined, in their organization. And so this also runs the gamut of different possibilities. That means it could be thinking about new ways that the community might be represented on the board of an organization. Sometimes nonprofits create new kinds of committees which engage community members in helping support the organization. There are various community events which might engage the community in helping provide either cash or in-kind assistance to the organization. And there's also collaboration with community organizations. I mean, I think that certainly collaboration is an important theme in social innovation in the plural sector these days, and many funders are looking to local nonprofits to be more collaborative and partner with other organizations, particularly organizations that are in the same kind of service space. You have your child welfare agency, you're looking to collaborate with other kinds of child welfare agencies. But so I think that nonprofits are thinking creatively about how they might work together. There's also so that there's collaboration on the programmatic side, right, where you might collaborate on providing a particular program, but there's also a lot of innovation about how nonprofits can collaborate on sharing expenses on the administrative side. And this includes co-location of services. You see a lot of experimentation about that, where a group of nonprofits might get together and buy a building or work together to reduce some of their expenses, and that can also lead to a lot of other kinds of innovation to the extent that nonprofits are all in close proximity to each other. So I think that there's a lot of innovation going on in this area. I think that the other area that where there's innovation is essentially trying to provide feedback to the organization on their programs. And I think that there certainly is a trend for more focus on performance and outcomes in nonprofits, and many nonprofits, particularly in the social services, healthcare area, are thinking creatively about how they can engage the users of their services in providing feedback. Not necessarily formal evaluation, but satisfaction with the level of service, or providing opportunities for some of the users to actually participate in the organization in a certain way, in some ways. Now this might apply to some types of social enterprises that are running programs or businesses that employ the users of service. So many examples of innovative social enterprises are for example, low-income people might work in a restaurant and learn skills in the restaurant trade, and that provides them a way of getting a job after they finish their time working in the nonprofits or the for-profits restaurant. So that there's thinking creatively about direct user engagement in the service in ways that I think were certainly not typical of a lot of these kinds of programs 20 or 30 years ago. I think that there's also hope that that other ways of direct engagement might be direct engagement in kind of participating in the board, participating in committees where you have the users of service be much more directly involved in kind of the ongoing oversight or governance of the organization. And so I think I certainly see that as another important trend that I think is partly being pushed in part by some of these social enterprises that have had quite a good deal of success in this area.
So I was listening to you speak about this engagement, which sounds to me like a really rich, sort of mutually supportive, mutually reinforcing relationship. It calls to mind human-centered design and design thinking as well. That a lot of companies do ethnographic work to understand their user. There's their titles within companies of user experience, chief user experience officer, and now it's being applied to social innovation and social entrepreneurship as well. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that nonprofit organizations are spending time listening in a different way to the end user in order to improve quality of service. And an example that comes to mind, I met a woman whose father directs the border between Mexico and California, and just the idea of putting shelter where long lines are waiting to enter the U.S. so that either they get shade under the sun or there's a cover in case it rains. That by itself was an example of the social innovation that just changed the experience. I'm wondering if you're seeing any of that.
Well, I think that there's a lot of emphasis these days in terms of best practices for nonprofit management, of thinking about doing strategic planning, coming up with a sustainable business plan, and consulting with your stakeholders, broadly defined. And I think that your stakeholders includes the recipients of your service and ways, as well as community members, other community organizations, and getting feedback about how you can develop programs that serve those needs. And I think that certainly, again, the implementation of this, I think, varies widely. I think some small community organizations find it difficult to do this because it does require a big commitment of time and resources. But certainly, I think one of best practice in nonprofit management these days is for organizations to think about their stakeholders, and that would include people who are using their services and their broader community. So.
Just to touch on the conversation of nonprofit management and nonprofits versus social entrepreneurship, because there's a lot of excitement about social entrepreneurship in the plural sector. And I was wondering if you have any comments on what you think are the positive parts of that conversation happening and that entry and the excitement around social entrepreneurship, and what you think may be some of the potential concerns that they've entered the space in such excitement.
Right. A great question. I think the interest in social enterprise and social entrepreneurship has certainly fueled a lot of innovation in the sector. The example that I just used of the nonprofit that is running a restaurant with employing disadvantaged people in the restaurant and learning new skills is a good example of that. it's an entrepreneurial type organization. They're earning a substantial amount of money through market income and not relying on traditional sources of philanthropic or government support. I think that, so there's a lot of great examples of those kinds of organizations, not only in the US and Canada and around the world. I think that the social entrepreneurship movement has also captured the imagination of a lot of young people. Many of my students, I think, are attracted to the possibilities of innovation and being entrepreneurial, and not, if they think of themselves as entrepreneurial, not having to go into the for-profit sector, but going into the nonprofit sector and thinking creatively about ways that they can combine a kind of market ethos with a social mission. And so certainly the growth in the nonprofit sector and the interest of many young people around the world in the nonprofit sector, I think, has been fueled by the interest in social entrepreneurship. And it certainly led to an infusion of money into the sector from particularly younger philanthropists who are also interested in innovation, and so I think that there's a lot of positives to this movement, and again, I think it's helped fuel a lot of innovation. I think that the one of the challenges is that this is also supposed to put the spotlight on so-called traditional nonprofit organizations that might be operating routine services, who might have been around for a long time, or some of them are all volunteer services, and so that some of these organizations might, by comparison, not appear to be so entrepreneurial. I think that the push to be entrepreneurial has certainly led to a shift away from some of these more traditional organizations to more innovative organizations. I think that, and so the implications, it seems to me, are one, for traditional nonprofit organizations, that they have to adapt to this new era, I think, which requires them to be more nimble and flexible, think about developing sustainable business plans, think about how they work collaboratively with their local community and the beneficiaries of their services. So I think that it's having important effects on the way that nonprofits have traditionally been managed. I think that another implication of the movement towards social entrepreneurship is that is also part of the attraction of some of these social enterprises and social entrepreneurship, is that it's also been accompanied by a focus on particular outcomes, and it comes with a performance orientation. And I think that also means the implications of that are for traditional nonprofit organizations that they need to think more about how they're measuring their success and tracking their outcomes. So, having said that, I do think that funders and policymakers also need to keep this in perspective. There will continue to be a demand for and need for routine services, whether it's child welfare services or providing meals to hungry people, or helping cope with disasters, or provide health care to people. And I think there's a whole array of programs that are valued services and that we know how to deliver them efficiently, and so there needs to be a recognition that, and support, both from private funders as well as public funders, of the need for those kinds of services. I think that the other implication is that we also need to keep in mind that a somewhat related point is keep in perspective this issue of performance, because some of these routine services are, we need these services to provide services to the public, but some of them, the outcomes of these programs might be elusive and hard to measure, and some of these programs also have a wide array of potential benefits for the community, including helping support local communities, employing community residents, contribute to social capital building in local communities. And so I think that we need to keep in perspective the kind of performance management movement in nonprofits, which I think is in part reflected in the movement towards social entrepreneurship, as well as in some ways the social entrepreneurship movement has contributed to the increased emphasis on performance. So,
you mentioned public policy in your response, and I would like to take a couple of minutes, since you're also an expert in public policy, just to ask what you believe can actually promote vibrancy in the space of the plural sector, and what might inhibit it in terms of public policy. What is good public policy about in this space?
Right. So I think that public policy certainly plays an important role here. And if you look around the world, that countries vary widely, and to what extent that they kind of help support the plural sector and help it grow and develop. I think that certainly there has been in this push for performance and this push for more competition, that I think that government regulations can undermine social innovation and also undermine the stability of organizations in the plural sector. And they can do that by too many short-term grants, too many regulations, inappropriate performance targets, and I think that so government needs to keep in perspective its interest in accountability and performance, and think creatively about how it can work with organizations in the plural sector to develop appropriate regulations, appropriate performance targets, and also think creatively about how contracts are designed and the length and duration of contracts. I think that both public, and I think that also applies to private funders as well, and foundations, that many foundations historically have focused on short-term, non-renewable grants, and I think that certainly there's a lot of attention in among private funders around the world to ways in which private funders can help foster innovation by thinking creatively about their grant-making process. I think, but back to public policy, I think that government and policymakers can also provide an important role in helping support the infrastructure and capacity of organizations in the sector, because too often government funding is insufficient to really adequately support the cost of service. That often means that it's difficult for nonprofits to adequately invest in their infrastructure, and I think that and so that kind of perpetuates a cycle of kind of instability in the organization. It makes it difficult to be creative and innovative. And I think that to the extent that the government can help either through direct funding or maybe indirect funding through providing technical assistance to nonprofits or to intermediary organizations, I think that government can play an important role in supporting the stability and sustainability of organizations in the plural sector. So.
Thank you. I also know that you have done quite a bit of research on public-private partnerships, PPPs. I wonder if a good example comes to mind of one of these PPPs really sort of knocking it out of the park.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of examples of PPPs today, and certainly there are a lot of good examples of public-private partnerships that involve the nonprofit sector, the for-profit sector, and the public sector. And I think that many leading national foundations and international foundations, such as the Gates Foundation or the Ford Foundation, have entered into these PPPs to address complex public problems. And certainly, a lot of the grant giving, for example, that the Gates Foundation has done in their health program has often been through PPPs. So, and some of them have had quite a bit of success in addressing the issues that they are working on. So I think that at the local level, I think that there are certainly many local foundations have been interested in doing these kind of cross-sectoral partnerships around economic development.
Mm-hmm.
And so many cities in the United States, for example, the local community foundation or a local family foundation might partner with the local university, a local nonprofit development company, maybe a leading company in the community, and help to do economic development in a particular area.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a lot of good examples, particularly in the economic development arena, of these kinds of cross-sectoral
Mm-hmm.
collaborations.
Quebec is another jurisdiction that takes this on board.
Yeah.
Last question. Henry asks the meta question in our MOOC, which is that the plural sector is composed of all of these different actors, creating social initiatives, driving social change, but it's still the little brother to the public sector and the private sector. And he asks the question, what could we do differently to actually be a more powerful sector?
Mm-hmm.
Powerful in the sense of, able to drive more change versus or in relation to these other two sectors that are powerful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that a couple things I would say about that is I think that there certainly has been greater interest in both the U.S. as well as elsewhere in the kind of advocacy role that nonprofit organizations can play in influencing public policy.
Mm.
And so you see new organizations that are coalitions of nonprofits that represent the interests of nonprofit organizations. And I think you see that in other countries as well, where you'll have a national organization representing nonprofit organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there are also more specialized advocacy organizations that might represent child welfare agencies.
Mm-hmm.
All the child welfare agencies in a particular country might be represented in a national organization. And so I think nonprofits need to do better at advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Many nonprofits are cautious about engaging. I mean, there are advocacy organizations whose sole purpose is advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are a lot of organizations in the sector, whether they're social service agencies or healthcare agencies or they're environmental organizations or arts organizations, whose primary mission is not advocacy, but they could play an important role in advocacy, broadly defined, in trying to influence important public policy issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that nonprofits need to become better advocates for their own organization and for the field as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think that sometimes it requires the investment of resources by nonprofits because there's, again, a lot of attention into service delivery and programs and not so much into advocacy. But I think it also means having boards of directors and people who govern nonprofits become more comfortable with being advocates for the sector and for their own organizations. So
we've covered a lot of ground. I want to just open a little window in case there's something that you feel that you want to comment on that I haven't asked about. If there's anything at all that comes to mind.
No. Well, I think that, as I said at the outset, I think that there's a lot of excitement in the plural sector today. I think that there's a lot of innovation going on in countries around the world. I think that there a lot of particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a growth of a lot of new organizations. A lot of those organizations now are at kind of crucial points in their organizational life cycle where they need to think about sustaining their organization and thinking about how they might collaborate with other organizations in either in the for-profit sector or in the plural sector, and so I think it's an important time for many social innovations or social enterprises that have demonstrated that they're doing interesting and creative and perhaps more effective work than had been done before in their particular field. But it's also a time when I think funders, meaning public funders as well as private funders, whether it's the local communities or nonprofits themselves, need also to be thinking about how we can institutionalize some of the important innovations and that have been established and developed in recent years. So,
thank you so much for engaging in this conversation, Stephen. Really appreciate it.
my pleasure.